You're at your old trusty boat. You call mighty sparrow. I'm in the city of Mardi Gras.
Welcome to the Sailing into Oblivion podcast. I'm your host, Jerome Rand. The second thing would be to make sure, if you can, if you're able to, stockpile a little bit of an extra stash, an extra couple hundred or a couple of thousand calories to be able to utilize if you have to go through something that will be a little more strenuous, or where you might have to be awake for a lot longer than normal 16 or 18-hour day. That will help, and it gives you just a little bit of extra security blanket to be able to sort of make it through a bit of a struggle. And then the last thing, and probably the most important, which is just a reflection on my biggest sort of screw up. I mean, it's almost so monumentally dumb what I did in the end, that it's stuff you see in a movie, and while you're watching it, you're like, "Don't do that! What are you doing? Don't do that!" And lo and behold, I did it. But no matter how sure you are that you are going to get out and reach the end of your rationing period, whether it be a resupply or a landfall or anything. I mean, this equates to being in the woods, camping, anything. Never, ever assume that you are out of the woods, so to speak, no pun intended, or you've definitely got the port in sight, and just start devouring food like it's nobody's business. Because you know what? If I wasn't the luckiest guy on earth, then I would have been blown away from my salvation by a big storm, unable to reach back to land, and then I would have been really out of luck. So don't ever count your chickens before they hatch. Make sure you stick to your rationing schedule as best as you can, and don't ever assume that you're out of it before you're actually 100% out of it and you've got new supplies. So that's pretty much it. If you want to support the show, as I always say, just follow the link in the description over to Patreon. Become one of our faithful crew members. There's 24 of us now, and it's fantastic. It's about the end of the month, which is essentially the time that I get my payday from everybody, and your support is hugely, hugely helpful in all future endeavors as far as sailing and also with the podcast. So thank you all so much. If you want to contact the show, just head over to sailingintooblivion.com and follow the podcast link over to a little email. Contact the show. You can reach right out, questions, comments, whatever you want. I always read them. Other than that, I've kind of have to tone down the amount of podcasts that I am doing at this point. To say the least, I am a little overwhelmed between work and working on the boat and the podcast and all the YouTube stuff. I'm drowning a little bit up here, and I'm feeling it. I came into this weekend with the best of intentions, and was just exhausted, and it's not a great place to be. And I do have to make sure that I'm saving some time to be able to hang out with friends and enjoy the main experience, as well as get all these things done that I want to do. I mean, I wish I never had to sleep, but I definitely have to. And I'm an old man now. I'm not some sprightly 20-year-old. I'm not even a 30-year-old. I'm a 40-year-old. So it's it's one of those things. So I'm going to try to stick to a schedule of minimum two, maximum three podcasts per week, and I'm going to try and stick to that as best as possible. But if we get back down to one show a week, it'll only be temporary, but it may have to happen a little bit as the workload for Sparrow becomes a little more important than anything else, only because I have to set sail in just over a month from now, and I want to make sure that we're safe, we're ready, and that's going to take quite a bit of work to get there. and just a dash of luck as well. But other than that, hopefully you enjoy this podcast about rationing food and what it was like to do so for months and months at a time while you are in the Southern Ocean and sort of dealing with Mother Nature at her worst. But yeah, here we go. Without further ado, rationing. Thanks for listening. I still remember vaguely the first inklings that I had that I was slowly devouring my food supply. Now, the whole rationing idea, as far as the food came out, was sort of a discovery. And it was something that I had already become sort of used to, having dealt with the lack of water that had been sort of forced upon me by the breaking of the desalinator pump right around the middle of the Indian Ocean. And so I was already in sort of a mode of not consuming everything I wanted. And I suppose on a sailboat, on a long journey, you're always in that sort of mode, but you've hopefully brought with you all the supplies you'll need to be able to stay fed and stay hydrated without too much worry and without too much sitting and thinking and wishing you could eat more. And when that situation flips into a time where you drastically have to limit what you can eat, it's psychologically and physically a big change. And that's sort of what had happened and was one of the large focal points of my trip around the world. And it was I had set off in October, so October, November, December, January. By the end of January, beginning of February, so my 5th month out at sea, I still vaguely remember. I believe it was running out of something. Either it was some sort of almonds or something. There was a staple, a snack that I had actually eaten the last bag of. I reached for more and I couldn't find any more. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, so I had already run out of all the fresh food, the produce, the potatoes, the onions, the oranges, things like that, months prior. And that was something I expected. I knew it was going to happen. I'd hoped to get 2 months out of the fresh food and the meats and the eggs and all that. And so that was sort of, it came, it went, it was no big deal. The party was over, so to speak. And then I was on to all the canned, all the dehydrated, all that. And so months went by, and it was as I was approaching Australia or underneath Australia when I ran out of something. And I can't put my finger on exactly what it was, but it sent sort of I don't know, I don't want to say a fear, but all of a sudden I knew that I was going to have to sort of scramble for a second and search around and maybe do an inventory. And that's exactly what I did. And out came all of the bins that I hadn't touched yet, all of the Mountain House packages of dehydrated meals, spaghettis, things like that, all the big tins of bulk items, and all the MREs and the bars and everything, every last little bit that I could find came out of the woodwork. And I just started counting and I started making list after list after list. And again, I was still in that mode, which was the big mistake that I had made in the beginning of counting servings as meals. And I can remember seeing, I want to say, yeah, the number was probably in the 300s, possibly a bit more. And again, this is entering the 5th month, so halfway through this voyage. And at that point, I had sort of assumed that I was going to be able to get around Cape Horn and into the Atlantic and make my way north rather quickly, much, much faster than I actually was going to. And I just sort of chalked it up to, okay, well, I better get this show on the road. I better get moving. But more importantly, I started to think to myself, okay, well, that means that even when I'm hungry, that's not exactly the signal to just sit down and eat something. It's more of a regimented idea of eating and sort of a battle, if you will, because you're always, like I said, you're always regimented. You know, you can't just sit there and eat every, bag of cookies because you're going to run out of them and then you'll never have any more. And with another possibly 4 months left, only an idiot would do that. And I am that idiot. I definitely had done stupid things like that. But in the end, you're essentially uh, it's a mental battle 100% because you're hungry and you've just eaten and you're still hungry and you're sitting on a boat and the world outside hasn't changed and you're sailing and maybe it's a little bit cold, which it definitely was. So you're burning up energy there. And I remember just thinking to myself, okay, boy, when do I get to eat again? How much can I eat? And that became sort of a daily issue or battle in my head of, all right, what am I going to get today? And when you're out at sea and the clock or the normal wake up at 7 or 8 and go to bed at 9 or 10 is not really a thing. And so many times you may be sort of battling your way through the day. You have your breakfast, you have your little lunch, you have your dinner, and then the winds change and the squalls roll in, and now you find yourself awake for an extra 5, 6, 7 hours and you're hungry. And to sort of forego any eating at 3 in the morning, knowing that you're still going to be awake for much longer is very, very difficult. And those were the times where you would either buckle and say, okay, well, I'll make a little thing of oatmeal just to warm me up and fill the belly. And I soon found that, when you do that, essentially you're just repeating the cycle of hunger pains and cravings over and over again. If you have a little bit, you might be satisfied for those few seconds that you're eating, but then instantly it returns to a grumbling stomach and hunger again, and now you just want more. I mean, it was almost a vicious cycle, almost an avalanche going on. And if you could abstain from it, then those typically eased off to a point where you didn't worry too much about them. But again, you're sitting on a boat and you're staring off either into the ocean or you're down below and staring at the wall, and you're thinking about all the things that you would like to eat, and you're trying to distract yourself. You're diving into books, you're doing anything and everything to sort of abstain from just the thought of food and of eating and the hunger that you're feeling. And I don't know, it was quite an experience, and not a bad experience. I don't think, and especially in the beginning. The beginning of the whole rationing thing was, I want to say almost. I don't want to say a welcome challenge because it definitely wasn't, but it was new to me. So it was interesting and it was exciting in a way because it was something I had heard about in other voyages and adventures. Obviously, we hear about people running out of food and this subject matter, and suddenly I'm thrown into this new sort of adventure on top of the adventure I'm already in, which somehow in my brain equates to a little bit of haha, here we go. Yes, we're really in it now. Don't ask me how, don't ask me why. It's nothing I summon up from my subconscious in any way, shape, or form. I don't control it. But I know that I'm lucky to have that because as long as I can remember, I've always had that mentality of when things get really, really tough, really demanding, really scary. That's sort of a time where something in my brain says, yes, this is what you wanted, and you're in it, and enjoy it. Enjoy this feeling. And maybe it's just that old thing of you're really living when you're sort of on the edge. I don't really know, but all I know is that's how I started to feel in the beginning. But now days turn into weeks, and weeks can turn into months, and you're in that same situation. And no matter how excited you are in the beginning, it's going to dull down and become this very marathon-esque, very, what's the best way to describe this? Just this drudgery that you go through, and you wake up hungry, and you know that it's going to be another day of sort of that same feeling and that same want. And you also have to remember at this point, I was down to, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 different items that I could really eat. There weren't a whole lot. There was a small selection of MREs from, chicken fajita mix to those rib-shaped pork patties, a couple of spaghettis, things like that. And then there were only really, with the Mountain House, I think it was mostly just chicken and rice. Maybe what was the other one? It was some sort of egg and chicken sort of thing. Tasted like it was trying to be some sort of Thai food or something like that. Then I had oatmeal, and then I had rice and a few cans of things, but not a whole lot else. There were just those sort of staples and lentils. I remember having a lot of lentils, and it you just knew, you knew what you had. You knew there weren't any more cookies. There weren't any more of the treats. The bacon, egg, and cheese sandwiches were long gone, and you could only dream about those. I mean, just a thought of that would send my mouth salivating for a long time. So I pretty much canceled those thoughts out of my brain. But essentially, you get underneath Australia, you get into the Pacific, and the only thing that was really distracting me was keeping Sparrow in some semblance of good shape and dealing with the different weather and all the systems on the boat. But again, you can work on a project for a couple of hours, but then eventually you're going to find your way back to that cockpit, back to the nav station, and back to sort of staring off into the distance and thinking about how hungry you are, and what you would really like to be able to do is eat as much as you can. And it's a miserable existence for sure, but it's a learning existence. At least it was for me, because this definitely was the first time in my life, thankfully, that I had ever had to experience something like this on such a prolonged scale. There had obviously been plenty of times where, in the early days of my 2-week camping trips with my friends, I had run out of food, and rationing for a day or so is not typically that hard. But this was a whole different story. And the fact that in the Pacific, I think, when it really hit home, I think part of that was the isolation that I knew I was in, where even if I headed for the nearest point of land, we're talking 2 weeks minimum to get there. As you get closer and closer to Point Nemo, believe it's 1,600 miles to the nearest point of land, and that's probably Easter Island. And even then, the options that you have there aren't all that great, because it's a pretty well-known spot for not being able to anchor. If the weather isn't right, you might not be able to make landfall at all. They don't really have a protected harbor that protects against everything. And so I don't know. It's these things, these issues sort of compiled one on top of the other on top of the other. So you had at its most basic, you just have you and the sailboat trying to weather the Southern Ocean, and then put on top of that, you are rationing how much water you have and having to take advantage of every last drop that comes out of the sky that you can actually consume. And sometimes if it had that a little bit of salt in it, then that's what I would use for boiling water for rice or for adding to the dehydrated meals and things. And so you've got those, and then to add on the fact that you're rationing this food and you're rationing it at a level, because it really was the Pacific when things became much more drastic, as far as trying to hold on to as much as I can, because at this point still I had it in my head that I was going to make it all the way back home without having to get any sort of resupply. And so I was rationing down pretty hard. And there were definitely days where if the weather was good and I didn't have to be out in the cockpit much and there weren't many sail changes or anything like that going on, then I really tried to conserve tactically my calorie consumption with my calorie usage, and I found that to be pretty useful as far as physically. Mentally, it was pretty awful, because even though you might not be burning a ton of calories, that doesn't tell your stomach or your tongue or your brain like, hey, you don't need it, so you don't need to be hungry. No, no, no. It doesn't work like that. You're still hungry. And if anything, because you're not active and you're not distracted, you're dwelling on the fact that you're hungry even more so. And it becomes sort of this battle. And I can remember some of the only oddball flavors that I was able to enjoy. There were really two things. I had two large jars of Tums, antacids or whatever they are. And then the other thing was some of this, oh shoot, it's that microbiome. Oh, I can't even remember what they call them, but it's just essentially these little powder things where you would take the teeniest little tiny spoonful and put it in some water, and it will you get a little bit of a flavor out of it. I think this was some sort of melon flavor thing, but it was for your gut biome, and so it's not something you would consume in bulk by any means. But it was a flavor, because at this point, the coffee was gone and the tea was gone and all the drink mixes or anything like that were gone. I do remember at one point trying and thinking it might taste pretty good, like a broth or something, to add garlic into some hot water, and that was definitely a mistake. That tasted terrible. The garlic was just like garlic chunks or something, a garlic powder, something you would find in your spice rack. But you really do. You start to, you're sitting in this boat, you're all alone, there's nothing really to do, and you're just searching around for anything and everything. And I do remember with the peaches were an absolute godsend, because they gave me hours. One can of peaches could give me hours of enjoyment, as they should, rightfully in this world. Though it doesn't, because the amount of it that's available is insane. And but at that point, having being down to the last just few, I can remember I would crack the can open, and I would take some of the peach juice and add it to hot water and sort of just slowly sip that, and that was wonderful. And then essentially add more water to it and chop peaches up in the can with a fork just to release more of the juices and have more of this sort of peach tea, so to speak, and then slowly eat each little piece of a peach. And oh man, it was absolutely amazing to be in that moment where you're actually being able to eat this and savor every last little tiny mouthful or tiny morsel that you're putting in. I mean, that's essentially, if life could be like that, it wouldn't take much to excite and keep people very happy because it felt so good after not having it for so long. And I know I've talked about that plenty of times on the podcast, but there is something so fascinating about abstaining from all of these things that are readily available. Because when you do, after a long time, all of a sudden, that thing that you really loved, that you thought was amazing, becomes absolutely astronomically good when you finally dive into it after not having it for so long. But as the Pacific started to come to a close, I again was sort of trying to use tactic as best as possible, and things were getting a little more dire as far as the amount of food that was running out. And I soon sort of realized that, unless I was catching tons of fish the minute I got to the Atlantic, and even then, I mean, the reality of that is pretty ridiculous to think that you'd be able to catch a fish almost every single day and be able to survive just on fish alone. And this being well before I had realized how much weight I had lost. This was something that was completely kept from me because I never pulled off all the layers of thermals that I had any time on the entire Pacific. So I took a bath just south of New Zealand, and the next time I would peel every layer off wasn't until after I was north of the Falklands. So 2.5 months. It's a long time. So for in my head, I didn't really think like, wow, I must be getting pretty skinny here. I just sort of thought, yep, everything's pretty much normal with my body. It's just my mind dealing with this constant hunger. And so start to make my dip south towards Cape Horn. And essentially what happens is I planned to take all of some of the heavier, easier to eat, like the last of the MREs and the last of the cans of food. Those were sort of stashed away with the idea that if we got into some pretty bad weather down south, rounding the Horn, I'd at least be able to get an energy boost and a morale boost, probably more than anything, from a nice, hot, delicious meal. And for the 2 weeks or so leading up to that, I was really just going to finish off the last of the oatmeal, in these tiny little bursts, and then primarily just be eating rice. And luckily, I did have quite a bit of soy sauce, so I could at least add some flavor to it. And rice was just such a funny thing because the tiniest amount, and I had bag after bag of this stuff, the tiniest little amount, and all of a sudden that jet boil is almost half full of rice. And when you're that hungry, just plain rice tastes fantastic. It's full of flavor. I don't know. It was amazing. And then to add a little bit of soy sauce, I mean, I'm thinking, wow, this is great. And you can eat a lot of it, but it doesn't go anywhere. And after 10 minutes, even though and not even 10 minutes sometimes, I can remember finishing off a whole like bowl of rice and listening to my stomach just growl as I was sort of swishing around a little bit of fresh water to clean the bowl and then also drink that. Because remember, nothing, absolutely nothing could go to waste at this point. And I don't know, it was it was a magnificent experience, but it was also pretty scary. And And I would sit and I would just think about food all the time, just how much I had. And it wasn't until about, I don't know, maybe a week or so out from Cape Horn that I had done my maybe 20th inventory of all this food and trying to really be exact as possible. And I can remember there was one windfall day where I had gone through and pulled out the grab bag to see if I had stashed anything in there. And I was able to, I found like 4 or 5 MREs. Um, then there was actually a couple of like energy bars or something like that. And so all of a sudden there was like this boost, like this discovery, and I was elated. I mean, it added this huge amount of different flavors and things like that. And it was really a day of sort of celebration. Um, and that aided me a little bit, but more than anything, it was super exciting. And you know, the funny thing is, on that note of discovery, this whole time of rationing and all that, there was placed from my brother Adam in the lazarette, just behind or underneath one of the propane tanks, a bag of beef jerky, just one of those little quarter-pound bags or something like that. And it sat in there that whole time. And I didn't discover it until I was tearing the boat apart after I had returned to land and was doing like the full clean out and everything. And I came across this bag of beef jerky. So there was undiscovered delicious treats all aboard while I was sort of going through this rationing experience. But there was just a point where I knew after adding up the numbers, it was not going to be possible. And I started thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to have to stop somewhere or not really stop, that was sort of the first thought was, am I going to be able to get food without having to stop? And that was sort of a key component because essentially there were like 4 or 5 guidelines to this voyage or goals, so to speak. I didn't want to be sponsored. I didn't want to have to anchor, to tie off, or run aground, so to speak. I wanted to do it completely unassisted. And let's see. Oh, well, I guess that's the 5. So those were sort of the guidelines, so to speak. And I really desperately knew that if any of those were to be broken, the one that I think I could live with the best would have been having to take assistance. Now, how to do that in my brain was a bit of a mystery, although I did have quite a few friends living on different islands in the Caribbean, and I figured it probably wouldn't be impossible to sort of set up a incognito, sort of sail into a harbor and get a bunch of food brought out and then just sail on out. That way I didn't have to anchor or tie off or anything like that. So the whole stopping part would never become an actual issue. But I also knew that those were still more than an ocean away. I mean, we're talking just get to Cape Horn and then turn north and get all the way to the Caribbean. Really, actually, it's an ocean and a half. You know, we're talking 6 or 8 thousand miles, and the timing wasn't going to work out. And then obviously you have the entire coast of South America that has possible ports to pull into and all that sort of thing. So there were a few options, and I can't remember where the idea of the Falkland Islands or the Malvinas sort of came into play, but essentially we started to investigate, and I remember touching base with my father about it, and he got sort of on the case, and as soon as he found out that I could just get in there and they would bring a supply boat out and then just give me the food and I could just keep on going, then all of a sudden it was time for an exercise in I'll almost lunacy, really, when I look back on it. Saying to someone in the condition that I was in, sort of rattled from the Southern Ocean and then also hungry and all of this, saying to that person, well, hey, put together a shopping list and we'll get you what you want. And I still think one of the biggest mistakes that I probably ever made on this trip was not having somebody check over that list and sort of take a look and say, okay, you have 35 logs of cookies, but you only have 1 pound of ham or something like that, and how come you're not taking on any fresh water, or how come you're not taking on any diesel? Well, the answers to those were that I felt like I wanted to, if I was going to sort of cave on this idea of pulling in and having to get assistance, I wanted it to be as minimal of assistance as possible. And I know that kind of does sound pretty stupid because if you're already going to take on some food, why not take on some water? Why not take on some fuel? But at that point, I had water and I was able to sustain myself for many months already. And I figured, you know what? I think as part of the adventure story goes, I think it'll be kind of a better thing, although risky for sure. And again, I'm not really thinking with a full brain at this point, but I'm thinking to myself, well, no, I don't need it. Then I'm not going to get it. And I need food because I'm going to run out very shortly. And so I need that. And I don't need fuel because I still had fuel. The engine hadn't even been running forever. And I just wanted the absolute necessities. Now, you could include the couple of bottles of alcohol that came on board as a need because I had run out of those already. I hadn't had any of those in months. So I quantify that as a food item because I was eating it and not as water because it was only dehydrating me, if anything. So that's my take on that situation. But that was sort of my thinking was, okay, well, if this is going to work, I'm going to be able to go in there. I'm not going to have to tie off. I'm not going to have to anchor. I can just float there, sails down, take the food on, and then sail right out, say thank you, and be on my way, and then crush the last couple of oceans and get home and make it all work. And now, suddenly, I'm sitting there with a notepad just a few days away from Cape Horn, and I'm trying to scratch together this shopping list of things. And I know that it's expensive and I don't have a lot of money as far as how much I had in the bank. And it was, I don't know, there were a lot of factors that were sort of floating around in my ocean addled brain. And I kept revising and redoing, and it became a focal point essentially. I was like sailing the boat, but then diving back down and trying to figure out exactly what I want. And then I would just think about having these items and these delicious treats. I mean, I had more cookies and M&Ms and things like that on that list. I mean, that was what my brain was just going straight to, and peanut butter and all this. And so I finally had the full thing. And I could have gone very easily. I could have just gone overboard and just honestly tried to restock the whole boat as best as possible. But again, there was this strange part of me sort of coexisting with the idea of not bringing on water, not fuel, and all that, was just this idea of like, well, I'm just going to get enough to get me through. I don't want to just completely blow it up and then have food to spare at the end of this voyage. I still need to make it this challenge. Like it was my mistake in the beginning, and I want to make sure that I pay for that mistake, if that makes any sense at all. And so that was the game plan, and it got submitted, and they were able to get pretty much most of it. I think I had to make a couple little changes here and there, but in the end, the game plan was set, and now it was just a small task of rounding Cape Horn and then being able to navigate right up to the Falkland Islands into Port Stanley, or at least the harbor, right? The entrance of the harbor there, and do it with a chart that had the Falkland Islands about the size of a quarter or so, without really any severe detail. Meanwhile, the entire time you're doing this in the furious 50s, as far as the Southern Ocean goes, and just trying your best. And so we get in there and we get to Cape Horn and we round that, and I break out the food. And at this point, it was sort of the tipping point as far as stupid decisions that I was making on this voyage. And I can't stress enough, but at the same time, I think it just had a lot to do with the fact that I wasn't thinking. I think the situation was is that my brain was not working the way it should have been. Only somebody taken away from that situation, looking at it as I am now, can say, wow, that was a really risky move there, buddy. And what I'm talking about essentially is that I just started eating everything. I like doubled my rations. I didn't worry about it because I was like, well, I'm going to get food in the Falklands. I'm going to get food in the Falklands. It's only a week or two away. What do we got? And I just started devouring and eating. And I did still try to have a little bit of, well, I tried to hold back essentially from eating all the good stuff. So the last cans of fruit, or the last of the MREs, I didn't want it to just be rice that I was left with after day 2, because I could have easily eaten every last little thing in one day, I'm sure. But essentially get around Cape Horn, and I'm still trying to sort of ration out these little things. Again, no idea that I've lost nearly 45 pounds. And I just remember eating rice. Whenever I got hungry at that point, I just ate more rice. I ate more and more and more and more. And I must have gone through an entire bottle of soy sauce in that time. But it was hot to eat, and it was very cold outside. It was snowing. It was below freezing. And so it was really the best, because boy, that rice just holds that heat. Something fierce. And so it was like the perfect treat to have in those latitudes. And I'm eating and I'm eating and I'm enjoying this, and it's making life very, very much more pleasurable. No longer am I just sitting there dwelling on what I can't eat. I'm actually just thinking, oh boy, I think I'll make some more rice. I got enough. I think in the end, and I can't be 100% accurate on this, but I think I probably had, on a normal daily diet without rationing, I maybe might have had 4 days of food left by the time I got to the Falklands. Ration that out to maybe a week. So that's how risky it was what I was doing, because essentially I was heading into the Falklands just as a pretty nasty gale was heading into the Falklands from the west. And we sort of met literally hours apart. I mean, when I got in there trying to beat into the wind to get up into this harbor to calmer weather to meet this boat, it was very difficult. It was done in like 30 to 40 knot winds and hailstorms and just really typical Southern Ocean sort of conditions, and it was only going to get worse and worse and worse through the night. And so really did quite frankly luck out. And there were times, days before, in between Cape Horn and the Falklands, where I was becalmed and I'm just sitting there like, I can't move, and trying to get the engine to work, and I couldn't do that because the engine was too cold. And I remember breaking the Raycor filter and all this sort of stuff, trying to get this engine going because I really wanted to have some emergency sort of system to be able to get me out of trouble because again, I didn't have a detailed chart of the area. So there's all these things sort of going on. And I think the one of the reasons that sailors are able to sort of do some of these things is essentially only because you can't just stop. You can't press pause and you can't say, "Oh, well, okay, come get me." It just that's not a possibility. You've put yourself into a situation where you have to get yourself out of it. And no matter what's going on, it's if you give up, well then you just sink and that's it. But if you carry on, you're going to have one heck of a story to tell afterwards. That's the bright side of thinking right there. But essentially, get in there, and I can still remember being along the coast through the night. And this was one of the longest stints of not being able to sleep because, one, I was trying to have any idea of if there were any dangers in front of me. Two, anytime you can see the lights of land, it's just I've never been able to sleep in those conditions because if the winds shift or something happens, then all of a sudden the boat starts sailing towards it if I'm down asleep. I mean, I've read too many stories about sailors doing that and then waking up as their boat pounds on the rocks or on a reef and then it's game over. So there I am, and I'm sailing luckily pretty much downwind, more on a broad reach. Maybe, I'd have to look in the logbook, but maybe 15 miles or less offshore from the Falklands. So, because I wanted to get into the lee, so to speak, and there was still a pretty monster swell coming up from the south, which was a little exciting. But it seemed like every half hour another hail squall was coming through, and I was pretty decreased on the size of the sails. And it's nighttime, and I'm eating rice and just cooking more and more of it, charging away, and I'm just squinting my eyes through the far darkness there, and I'm just looking for this one lighthouse light, and I'm looking for the blinking light, and I just about as the half light starts to come up, that's when I see it. And I know that's the lighthouse that marks the entrance to this little harbor that I was going into outside of Port Stanley. And I'd been told by a few different sources about what I should be looking for and the shape of the little islands that are around and what the harbor might look like and where it's going to be safe to sail and all that. And as the night turns into day and I start getting my bearings and obviously I can see land and everything and I can start to see these rocks. And again, it's just one of those situations where to my brain at that point, compiled with the sleep deprivation and sort of weathering the really bad squally weather for the last like 36 hours on top of just the last few months of the Southern Ocean and the rationing and all this stuff going on, your brain is cooking up all these things. And it's a really interesting time. I mean, I can remember, I closing my eyes right now, I can picture it. I fully, like not even a glitch at all. I can remember pulling in and coming up and seeing these rocks and not understanding because it didn't look like I wasn't seeing what I was expecting to see from what I was told, and thinking to myself, holy cow, and the wind angle. Essentially, there's a few little rocky outcrop islands. There's about three of them just off of this point where this lighthouse is, and I'm looking at it, and the swell is going, and the winds aren't too bad at this point, but they're building. And if I go around these rocks for another mile or so, that's going to take a long time to then beat back directly into the wind to get into this harbor. But if I cut in between these rocks, and there's a lot of space in between them, but I just don't know what the depth is. And I can remember just sitting there and I'm thanking the world around me that there's a swell, because the swell at least can indicate a bit of whether or not there's there's going to be some real shallow areas. And I've got my binoculars and I'm like squinting and looking for any signs and I'm ready to just jibe out of there. And luckily the winds were in a decent direction where I could maneuver very quickly if I needed to. And I can remember coming up and I'm seeing these islands and I'm sort of glancing my head over one side, back to the other, and I'm looking at these islands sort of go by, and I'm just hoping that this isn't going to be the tragic end of my voyage. And I get through, and now I'm seeing the whole harbor, and it's just covered in these whitecaps. They're small waves, but they're just whitecaps because the wind is just howling down this little harbor. And there's another little island, and I'm seeing whale spouts, and there's kelp beds. So a lot of stuff to take on. I've come from just essentially just ocean and just waves to now lots of other things, lots of input, and there's no boat. I'm just in this harbor, and it's just me, and I'm thinking, holy cow! And there's so much going on at that point that when the Garmin InReach went off and suddenly there's somebody trying to contact me, it was this like ping in my head of like, okay, we got another one. Now we've got the outside people. So it's not just me anymore, which was sort of a shock at first. And then that led to, I'll never forget, that led to a funny thought, like a pause from the whole situation. Just thinking to myself, I wonder how many people are actually like kind of watching this, so to speak, through, at that point, it would have been Facebook, I guess, little updates and things like that. I don't know, or just people calling and talking to my father. Yeah, I don't know. It was just a funny thought of being like, I wonder if there's people actually, sort of waiting by the phone, trying to see how this whole thing goes down. Because for me, knowing what it was like and being in it, it was rather exciting. Whether or not anybody in the outside world would have thought that or known that is anybody's guess. But in any way, it was kind of a funny break. And then finally, I got the text that said they've spotted you and they're on their way. Look for the red boat. And so now I'm like, wow. So I'm just sort of going back and forth on the same track, not too far up because I don't know exactly what's going to happen here. And I wanted to just stay in relatively known water that I've at least gone back and forth in. And I'm doing it under storm sail and triple reef main. And I do have, luckily, I have like 5 or 6 pictures that this boat took of me in that. And it looks absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you got Sparrow's big hull, bright and white with these sort of green stripes on it and stuff. And then you've got these teeny little sails, but we're still like heeled way over. And the boat comes back and it points to the little cove that we're going to go to, which so funny when I got finally a proper chart of the Falklands. I see that the next cove upwind of the one that we went to, was called Sparrow's Cove. And how poetic and how crazy would that have been? What a coincidence to actually get resupplied in Sparrow's Cove. Would have just been absolutely nuts. But in any event, I had no idea of any of this. And they direct me up there. It's directly upwind, and the winds are now really pushing into that 35 plus knot range. So pretty much getting into like the gale force. But again, we're in a protected harbor, so the waves aren't very big. But I'm not making any headway at all. And ended up finally just throwing the staysail up, and that, after another like 45 minutes or so, gets me upwind and drop sail. And they just pull right up alongside. They luckily had a big old rub rail. They bump into the boat, and then just boom, it's instant. Just throwing boxes right onto me, and very fortunate that they said, "Hey, listen, you can just drift. You're gonna drift right out of here. We'll keep an eye on the boat, and you just stow everything you need to stow." And before I stowed even one iota, one crack or anything, everything just got thrown right down below. First thing I did was grab a bottle of scotch and take a big swig off of that in sort of celebration. It was pretty amazing. And I did it right in front of them and everything. And they're 50 feet away from the boat at this point, and Sparrow's just sort of drifting. But as we're drifting, the waves, as we get further and further away from land, the waves get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I tried, everything just was happening so fast. It was so overwhelming, and I just couldn't do everything at that same time. And I was like, okay, well, let me get stuff stowed to a point where it's not going to break. Let me get the things in the fridge that need to be in the fridge. Everything else, except for that log of cookies, that bag of M&Ms, that bottle of scotch, and let's just really quickly make a tiny ham sandwich because that would be the greatest thing in the world. And 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 let's try and sail as well. And there was another, essentially I ended up getting the sails up once everything was sort of stowed, and I was sort of devouring food as well, and all this stuff. It essentially goes, and I get the mainsail up, and I start just heading downwind, and I'm heading away from the island, away from the shore. There's ships around, so at this point, and I'm sort of having to avoid them a little bit. So I'm dashing from down below stowing to up top and taking a look to make sure I'm not going to hit anything. And I've just got to get past one more point of land, and then I'm free, but it's all downwind sailing to it. So the sailing part is pretty easy. And I'm back to stowing and devouring, and the waves are getting bigger and bigger. So now I'm getting sort of tossed around in the boat, and it's a little bit wild. And I remember having to get all of the cardboard off of this boat because cardboard has a nasty little habit of keeping cockroach eggs in it and just having cockroaches as well. And I don't know what their situation is on those islands. And I had one cockroach earlier on in the voyage, and so it was something that was definitely on my mind. And thinking to myself, all right, well, I got to get rid of this. All this cardboard's got to go, but you can't just throw cardboard boxes in the ocean because they have tape and labels and all this sort of stuff. So all that has to come off first. So I'm down, and you got to picture me. I'm devouring and I'm stowing and I'm ripping apart cardboard and ripping labels off of it, and then folding the cardboard and throwing it in the cockpit and throwing it in the cockpit. And this is sort of going on, and we're getting rolled more and more. The wind and the waves are building up, and hail squalls coming in, and I'm still trying to eat stuff, and all this is going on. And then at some point the weight of Sparrow, the motion of Sparrow changed, and essentially I'm kind of like, it just doesn't feel right. And I think we took one pretty decent little breaker over the stern, sort of got pooped, as they say, and I poke my head up, and as soon as I get up there on just out of the companionway hatch, I see how much water is all over Sparrow, not just in the cockpit footwell, which holds about a half a ton of water, but as I look forward, it's all over the deck, like we're bowed down a little bit. I'm thinking to myself, what in the heck is going on? And then, boom, I see it. All this cardboard had already turned to mush. Saltwater just eats this stuff alive. And it had already sort of turned to mush and plugged up all the scuppers all over the boat. And so all the water that was coming on was staying on. And, Sparrow's got pretty big bulwarks, the little walls on the outer edge of the sailboat. So it was holding quite a bit, probably a couple tons of water. And it was essentially pushing us down, sinking us, if you will. And so I'm scrambling up there and trying to push all this stuff out and get it out of the scuppers, and we just start offloading water. I mean, it's pouring. I've never seen it like that before. And then we sort of get back into a better rhythm, and I'm a little more cautious about what I'm doing here. And lo and behold, as the day sort of turns into night, I've got pretty much everything stowed. It's off the cabin floor, and I'm pretty happy because I actually get to have a wonderful, delicious dinner of one can of ravioli, which was amazing because it was hot and I hadn't had some in so long. And also be able to sort of finish things off with a nice cocktail, a little sundowner, and some cookies. I mean, the cookies, you just can't say enough about them. Chocolate chip, delicious, dry. I can't remember the name of them. They've always got different names in different countries, but essentially, Chips Ahoy cookies, but from the Falkland Islands. And it was absolutely amazing. And I hadn't slept now at this point, I don't know, close to 40 hours, which is an insane amount of time for what I'd been through during that time. And as the night comes on, the gale really starts to kick up. The waves get pretty big, and it turns out that we're still in some sort of shipping lane or something like that, because not long after dark, the AIS starts blowing up, and I see that there's a ship directly behind us, and it's pretty much going the same direction. It's moving a lot faster than I am. And this is a situation where I was sort of getting a little panicky, I think, because of the lack of sleep. Probably my brain wasn't working very well from all the sugar that I had eaten that day as well. I'm sure my body was thinking, holy cow, but what is all this? And I'm trying to get them on the VHF, and I'm getting nothing there. And so I pull out the handheld VHF, because by this point, they're pretty close. I can see their lights in between the waves and everything. And my heading is changing quite a bit, because I'm slewing around in these waves, and it's just sort of a nightmare situation. He's getting closer and closer. Get within about a half a mile, directly behind me, and it was going to be a close pass. I couldn't get any communications going with them at all, and just was stressful. It was a time where I wanted nothing more than to just be able to go to sleep. And again, I'm just stuck awake middle of the night. And I remember finally, once it passed, I was able to get a good couple of hours of sleep. But before sunrise, around the 3 or 4 in the morning range, suddenly the winds, as they do after these systems go through, start to die off, and the main starts to slat, and I have to put up more sail. And so I'm up and I'm doing all this stuff. But at this point, it really didn't matter too much, because it meant I could also have another snack. And that was one of the times where I just, I don't know, I felt more alive, I think, than almost any time in my life, and definitely felt pretty accomplished at that point, just from not from the entire voyage in its scale, but just in the last 2 days of trying to approach this island, make up for all the mistakes I made, and get the food, and get back into a zone where I can continue and finish off the voyage. And shortly thereafter, the next day was the day where I essentially was becalmed and found out just how close I was to really being in serious trouble as far as my weight. I did a bunch of work on replacing the VHF aerial up on the spreader, which sent me up and down the mast, I don't know, 6 or 7 times. And after all that was fixed and all that was done, or at least I assumed it was fixed, because there were no ships around to be able to try and communicate with. But in any event, I essentially was able to peel off all the layers and take about a 1/4 gallon hot bath, pouring a little bit of fresh water over me. But I'll never forget being down below and peeling all those thermals off. I was wearing probably 3 or 4 layers, and seeing the veins sort of draping from my shoulders down and then across my belly and on my legs, and thinking to myself, holy cow, I've never seen that before. And sort of feeling my stomach and really visibly seeing this 8-pack abs that I've never had in my life, and just realizing, holy cow. And I remember after that bath, I put some deodorant on, and I couldn't fit. The deodorant bar wouldn't fit all the way up into my armpit. It had sunk in so far. And I did a little photo op, and I'm glad I have those photos of just me in a pair of boxers, sort of just flexing and all that sort of stuff. Very reminiscent of like a Bruce Lee or something like that. Teeny little muscles, but very defined. And I was so ghostly pale. When I look at videos and pictures of myself in that whole Cape Horn era, pre that shower, I looked sort of weathered and tan and wrinkly and all this sort of stuff. And that was all just dead skin and dirt and sunscreen and all this gross stuff that I'd never really washed off of my body for months. And when I finally did, I was as pasty as a ghost, and it was definitely pretty shocking to see what 2.5 months of rationing had done to my body. But I had the cookies, I had the food, and I made up for it in short order after that. It's the rest of the story is, I don't know, it just goes on and on. But in any event, I don't know. I just figured I would talk about this one today on a little solo podcast this Sunday morning. I hope you enjoyed that story. It's one of my favorites to tell, especially in person, because I get pretty animated when I talk about eating and stowing and drinking and eating and stowing and sailing and sinking and all that sort of stuff. It's definitely a lot of fun. But other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. More to come, and thanks for listening.